2 frames. Now, if I really thought that was a serious picture, I would have shot like a roll of film in those days. It was a throwaway thing. I looked in, saw this thing, took the picture, and then left. I gave there's a very famous calligrapher, Dr. Ahmed Mustafa, who is from Egypt, and I was going to visit him one day, and I took him a print of that. And he looked at it and he said, "Oh, I think that picture's got golden ratio, divine proportion." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Didn't you ever study art?" I said, "No, I didn't. Yeah, I'm self-taught." I don't use the word convert because I think it's very confusing for people who aren't Muslim, because it kind of, as an outsider, it sounds like you were something and you became something else. And I never felt that. I've always felt that I'm the same person. Maybe I'm modified the way I lived, but inside I'm still the same person. I didn't become something different. And I think that's confusing for people, especially if the person who's become a Muslim suddenly starts dressing like an Arab or a Asian or something. That for a Westerner, that's really confusing. And I think it's an important message to put out. You don't become a different person. You're the same person. And many of them had never been photographed before. Many of them passed away after I did the picture, which was very disconcerting for me. I thought, well, if the word gets out, it's so arrogant to think that I had any power over everything. And I met Dr. Mustafa Badawi in Medina, and he said, no, that's the reason they let you take their picture. They were leaving, so it didn't matter anymore. I prefer people because they're just so fascinating, but it's harder for me for people because I'm quite a shy person, and it's kind of, you have to get over that because people being photographed usually are very nervous anyway. I'll never forget him. His name was Artie Rip, and he was the head of Buddha Records, and he wore like a cowboy hat, and he came into the flat, and he knew that I was interested in photography, and he said, and he sort of produced this silver box, and he said, "What do you think about this?" And he opened the silver box, and there was a Nikon camera body and a Canon, and there were lenses, and I was like, "Wow, that's amazing." The scholars said that there were Muslims in this country had 3 choices. So it was isolation, assimilation, or integration. Isolation is not acceptable because we're a community-led people, and assimilation means that you become part of the society, but you lose your core beliefs. And integration is the middle path. I know people don't like this word, but it's in the middle. And I think it's the best description I also am guilty of that because in the early years I was traveling all the time, and I left my wife looking after. I had my son from a previous marriage and 3 daughters, and she really looked after them. I mean, I used to come back, and it was difficult, being away from them, but I was doing my thing. And it was funny. I'm sorting out all my stuff in the loft, and I found all these postcards that I'd sent to the girls when they were very young. And I showed it to my daughter, and she said, "We always used to think that you went away and forgot about us." And that it was very clear that I did, but they were too young to read. So my wife would have read them to them. But it was kind of, "Oh, you didn't forget us. You didn't just go away and forget us." It was just like, and it was, it's easy, but I needed to do it. This was it was my livelihood and what I was doing on my journey. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest sacrifice.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the MuslimCentric podcast, where we hope to educate, inspire, and entertain on issues relevant to Muslim life. I'm your host, Aman. This episode is a Desert Island Gems interview where I ask my guests to imagine they are cast away to a desert island with 8 gems of wisdom which have been important throughout their life journey. My guest is the world-renowned photographer of the Muslim world, Sidi Peter Sanders. If you don't recognize his name, you will have definitely seen his photos. Born in the 1940s in London, he became a professional photographer and took iconic pictures of Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and many more bands of the 1960s. He converted to Islam and took the early photos of the Hajj and has been taking photos ever since. Brother Peter Sanders has produced books which contain photos that will literally take your breath away. I'll list some of these books in the episode notes, including his most recent one, Exemplars for Our Time. In this episode, I ask him about his early life, how he became a photographer, his conversion to Islam, art and culture in Islam, and the art of spirituality. Please do support the podcast by subscribing to our YouTube channel, leaving a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcast, and spreading the word to friends and family. Inshallah, it'll help others benefit from the podcast. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the interview. Assalamu alaikum, Sidi Peter Sanders.
Walaikum salam, rahmatullah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll be sharing some insight particularly into your life and your journey so far. And it's such a fascinating journey indeed. So really privileged that you're joining us from your home before you go off to many other travels. I think
Yes.
you are traveling so much. So mashallah, may Allah give you the strength to keep going and
Ameen.
traveling across the world.
Ameen, inshallah.
Okay. Um, Sidi Peter, could I just maybe start off at the beginning and a bit about your early life and your childhood? Could you just tell us a little bit in terms of what was your early childhood like?
I was an only child. Um, what else can I say about it? I think, on looking back, I had a very strong connection with my grandfather. And I discovered this was after, actually, he died when I was 16. He was in an accident crossing the road. But the previous years with him, I felt he was always like nurturing me. Um, I discovered, as I said later, after he passed away, that he had been a photographer during a lot of his life, and I didn't know anything about that part of his life. Um, but when I knew him, he was one of the things he did was he collected stamps from around the world, and he used to share these stamps with me. And I think what he was doing was um, nurturing me into the love of travel and also the love of images. Because I don't know if you've ever looked at postage stamps, but they're like a concise, they're very, a lot of time goes into producing them and designing them. And I was fascinated by all these countries, all the Commonwealth countries around the world, and he definitely opened that thing up in me.
So was there quite a desire at an early age to travel and to see the
I
world?
was curious about it, yeah. I remember someone came and gave me a present from Scandinavia. It's a carved horse, and they are very typical of, I think, Sweden. But I remember, like, that moment when they gave it to me, oh, this is from another country outside of England, and just, oh, I was curious. I wonder where, so I always had this fascination about other worlds. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you were an only child. Do you think that was then significant in developing love of photography? I guess it's something that you could do in your own time and
Yeah, I think so. I was used to spending time on my own. It didn't bother me, and just going off to India on my own, which I did in 71 by myself, was not a big problem.
yeah,
I was kind of testing myself a little bit, I
yeah.
think, by doing it. Yeah.
And do you think, apart from that, were there any other kind of early experiences which then shaped you to become the person that you became as an adult and later on in life?
Um, I'm sure there were. I mean, in the 60s, I became very, particularly the late 60s, I became aware that as a person, I was quite anxious. And that awareness got me to look for a solution to that. And I started reading Emerson and various books, spiritual books at that time. And then I read, which I've sort of discovered is really interesting. I read Autobiography of a Yogananda, which apparently was Steve Jobs' favorite book, so much so that when he died, all the high and mighty that came to his funeral were given this book in a brown envelope, and it was Autobiography of a Yogi because it was part of his journey. And, he was very interested in spirituality, particularly the Hindu path, and he went. I just learned this recently. He went and lived near the ashram of Yogananda, although Yogananda had already passed away by then. Um, so there were some similarities in that, and I started meditating. It was like a correspondence course because Yogananda had already passed away. The important thing about Yogananda was that he was a spiritual adept and he had a master, but he also traveled to the West and so he was one of the first people that brought meditation in the 50s to America and the UK. And he met people like Einstein, and he found this links between spirituality and science. And so he was well known for that. His story is really, really interesting, and it really inspired me, and it inspired me to go to India, actually.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about is about, I guess, the 1960s and 70s. And um, you were born in the 60s in London, and then we hear so much about the 60s and the 70s and what the culture and the environment was like, and it was quite a unique time. And I guess you
Yeah,
touched
yeah,
upon about that, I guess, that search for spirituality. But what are those kind of recollections that you had around that time, in particular the 60s? Why was it so special? And I mean, because one of the things that obviously with your photography, you very much photograph many famous kind of bands and singers
yeah,
from Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, Rolling Stones, etc. So you're really amongst that culture that we know of. So
yeah.
some of us that missed out that decade, what was the flavor and feel of it? What was going on at that time?
We have to remember that I was born right after the end of World War II, and the way that I describe it is there was a kind of spiritual grey fog hanging over, particularly UK, and I don't know about America, but definitely the UK. So they'd just come out of a war, and then also there was nervousness that there would be another war, with all the things that were happening in Cambodia and Cuba and all of these. So there was definitely the threat of war, and I grew up in that. And I think the '60s came in to shine a bit of light into it and to bring some positivity and change in the culture. And I think that's really what it was. The whole movement was about anti-war, it was about peace, but also a lot of other things like spirituality came into sight, eating healthily, meditating, all these things, feminism, all those things started in that period. And I do see a lot of similarities to what's happening now. We have wars going on, and there's now a big movement about ecology and the planet and looking after the planet and all these things. So I do find a lot of parallels between that period and what is happening now. I did feel for a long period that the youth were not really interested in what was going on in the world, but I think this generation definitely are.
Mm.
And there's a certain transparency that things that were able to be got away with in the past are not allowed to be got away with now.
And you do wonder about, I guess, those parallels and those kind of peaks and troughs now, as you mentioned, because
Yeah,
there was obviously the recent UK census, which shows the majority of people don't believe in God now, and you
yeah,
wonder whether actually at some point then it'll swing back because people will be looking for
yeah,
searching and meaning and purpose and that existential kind of thinking about where they're going in life, and
yeah,
moved on from all of the materialistic stuff of the 80s and the 90s. So you do
yeah,
wonder about what will follow. Mm.
absolutely. Because I think just looking at it in our own lives, when we get lost, big things happen to bring us back to the the reality of things. And so, yeah, it definitely feels like that time, and I do feel in the youth a kind of enthusiasm for things to change, and that's not a bad thing when things are not going that well.
And so, but in the 60s, so how did photography become your profession, or how did you then get to something that might have been a hobby to then something that was more significant than that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of when I tell this story, people just can't kind of amazed by it. But I was always interested in the idea of framing things, and I used to do this. I've told this story a lot. I used to put a frame around things with my fingers and just think, well, if you remove that and you zoom into that, then you can see that whatever it is, how it really is. You're not distracted by all the other things around it. So I used to do that very naturally, and I always thought that I would work in in that kind of world, but I thought maybe it would be filming or TV cameraman or something. But then um, I was living in a very nice mews flat in London, near Regent's Park, and I'd been living there by myself. But then I was struggling to pay the rent, so there was a friend of mine who was a BBC DJ, um, who became quite famous actually. But he needed somewhere to live, and I said, "Oh, why don't you come and share the flat with me?" So we kind of he moved in, but I hadn't sort of thought about it. Because he's very famous and very popular. The house was always full of people and fans, and you know. Groups, and it was just like I lost my peaceful place. But one day, this guy arrived. Uh, I'll never forget him. His name was Artie Rip, and he was the head of Buddha Records, and he wore like a cowboy hat, and he came into the flat, and he knew that I was interested in photography, and he said, and he sort of produced this silver box, and he said, "What do you think about this?" And he opened the silver box, and there was a Nikon camera body and a Canon, and there were lenses, and I was like, "Wow, that's amazing!" And yeah, I've kind of left a bit out, but I'll come back to it anyway. Up to that point, I had like a simple Pentax camera. It was still a studio camera, but it was I had no money, and I got a tax rebate from the government, and for £60. And my friend said, "Oh, there's a studio camera being sold for £60." And I said, "Okay, I'm buying it." So I had that, but it was a bit limited to what I could do with it. So this guy Artie Rip arrived with the case, and I was looking. I felt like a kid in a candy store. I was going, "Oh, this is amazing!" And he shut the lid on the box and he said, "You take it. I don't need it at the moment, and I'll get it offered for you at some later point." So he just handed me this box, and I was like, "What?" So suddenly I had like all this professional equipment. So I carried on doing pictures of rock stars and just building up my own business. And after about a year, I had a jar of coins. So whenever I needed to go to a job, because I had no money, whenever I went to go to a job, I took the coins to pay for the train fare or the bus or something. And after a year of doing that, my business was turning over and I had money. And I went back, met him in some hotel in Park Lane, and gave him back the cameras and bought my own. So
That's a fascinating
yeah,
story. And I guess you often hear about it's these opportunities in life that just come out of nowhere, don't they? And it can change people's lives, and
it's
this
a really
sometimes
clear sign. And then on top of that, I had met my landlord one day. I think on the street or on the underground. He said, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I just started doing photography." And he said, "Oh, that's interesting." He said, "The guy that used to live in your flat did photography, and he left some equipment. Maybe you can use it." So I inherited a whole dark room and the whole thing, and so I set that up in the bathroom. And
fantastic. And were you self-taught in terms of
yeah,
photography, or did
yeah,
you go to any do
self.
college or school, university, or did qualifications in
I
photography?
didn't, and whenever I got stuck, if I didn't understand something, I thought, oh, okay, I'll go to the professional camera shop, and I'd go in and I'd say to the man, could you tell me about apertures and shutter speeds? And he talked to me for 10 minutes in a language that I did not understand. And I obviously wasn't meant to understand. It was not for, young whippersnappers like me. It was the elite of the elite did photography. So I just had to learn by myself, which is what I did.
Fantastic.
Taught
And,
myself.
and so we'll come back to your journey, but we're going to set you on this desert island
Yeah.
on your own, and you're going to take some of these gems away with you. So, what is the first gem, Sidi Peter, that you've
Okay.
chosen to
And
take
I'm
with
going to set, it's quite nice. We were talking about the 60s. So this is towards the end of that period. I was living in Notting Hill Gate in a one-room attic flat. This was after I left the other place and moved into a much smaller place. And it was a one-room attic flat that I'd painted bright sunshine yellow. Even the radio was painted yellow, and even the tin bath, because it didn't have a bathroom, so I had like a tin bath in there.
such a
Funny,
60s image?
yeah, it was really small. And one great morning, I woke up and I was feeling like I need some inspiration. So I thought I'll venture out from the flat and with my camera in hand and take some photos. So as I wandered through the nearby streets, I discovered this was in near Portobello Road area. So I was wandering around the streets and I discovered a series of derelict houses which had been painted black for a film set, and someone had graffitied on one of the walls, "We teach all hearts to break." So in big letters, it just put, "We teach all hearts to break." And I was like, what does this mean? Like it was like a message to me, but I didn't, what does it mean? "We teach all hearts to break." Anyway, I lifted up my camera to take a picture of it, and a boy ran in his school uniform, right? Ran like across the image, and that's the shot I got. In the following years after that incident, I then went to India. So fairly soon after that, I went off to India on my spiritual quest, and I was in India for 7 months. I then returned to England and discovered Islam. I'd seen Islam in India, but I was looking at all the different religions. I was studying Hinduism and Buddhism and Sikhism, and I read a bit about Islam. And then I I kind of discovered Islam, and then just before Ramadan, I traveled to Morocco and I spent the whole of month of Ramadan in what's called a zawiya of a great sage and saint, Sidi Muhammad Habib. And so I had that very powerful experience. And then 3 months later, I performed the Hajj. I then discovered this ayah: we should show Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, we should show them our signs upon the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that this is the truth. And I realized that ayah reminded me of that graffiti I had seen, because all that stuff happened right after I saw that thing, and I did all that stuff. I went around India looking for a teacher. I came back, and then I was in Morocco, and it was tough for me being in Morocco. It was not a rich. The Zawiya was very poor. It had miskeen kind of fukra there, and it was hard for me. It was tough. It was cold, and I was fasting for the first time and all that. So it was like, but that's something I realize now, that seeing that piece of graffiti was really important for me, and I really that ayat does kind of stay with me a lot.
I think that's beautiful, and I guess it's that idea of sometimes in life, you need to get broken down, or you need that hardship, or you need that kind of almost come to some sort of breaking point, or
Yeah,
rock bottom before you can then rebuild afresh, and I think
yeah.
there's so many of those kind of
Also, my Hajj was really hard. I mean, it was 1971. It was tough in those days. There were no proper toilets. We got sunstroke. We lost our the guys who were supposed to look after you on the Hajj vanished and stuff. So we were like left on our. So it was a tough Hajj. But it was very blessed, mashallah. Met
So you went in 1971, didn't you? And so you'd become a Muslim in about 2 years earlier, is that right?
not 2 years, no. So all that happened. I went to India in '71.
Okay.
The first 7 months of '71, I was back a month, and then I accepted Islam, and then I went to Morocco and did Hajj at the end of that year. So all that happened in a year.
What a massive transformation in
Yeah,
in that time.
yeah,
And I guess there's um a number of very prominent British and American uh, people that became Muslims around that time as well. So I'm just really fascinated to learn a little bit around what that kind of environment was, particularly for Muslim converts, because I guess a lot of the Muslims into the UK around that time were migrants from
yeah.
um,
Mostly, yeah,
places like South Asia, etc., Pakistan, India. But there was also this other community that was growing, and particularly, fascinated about this kind of the Norwich Muslim community. And I know there's a film that was made, "Blessed Are the Strangers," and we know, Cat Stevens' use of Islam and people like Sheikh Hamza and stuff. There's this
yeah.
something going on around that time as well. But
There's a lot, yeah.
what was? Are you able to share any memories of what that was like for the Muslim convert community, particularly in the West and in because people are not too dissimilar from going from the rock or the pop style, pop kind of background to then looking for searching and finding Islam.
Yeah.
I'd be fascinated to hear a little bit in terms of what was that kind of Muslim environment, and were you familiar with the Norwich Muslim community at that
Yeah,
time?
I knew that when they were in London. I knew that community. But
Yeah,
I have one thing. I don't use the word convert because I think it's very confusing for people who aren't Muslim, because it kind of, as an outsider, it sounds like you were something and you became something else. And I never felt that. I've always felt that I'm the same person. Maybe I'm um, modified the way I lived, but inside I'm still the same person. I didn't become something different. And I think that's confusing for people, especially if the person who's become a Muslim suddenly starts dressing like an Arab or a
yeah,
Asian or something. That for a Western, that's really confusing. And I think it's an important message to put out. You don't become a different person. You're the same person. And I've been working on a project for 20 years, which I hope to publish next year, which is about Muslims in China. And China is one of the few places where they have such a strong Chinese identity, and I love it because it's really interesting. They're not Chinese who became Arabs; they're Chinese who became Muslims, and so that it's a continuation from their Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist tradition. And the way that Islam was presented to them, it wasn't seen as a threat. It seemed that it was presented as a continuation of what they
yeah.
really believed in.
But
And I think
it's quite
that's
a
really
cl-
important.
yeah, it's quite a clunky term, isn't it? Because we hear about convert, and then we hear revert, and then
Yeah, reverse,
what
even worse. It's just
one of the funny ones that I always hear is when they say new Muslims and say, when does a new Muslim stop becoming a new Muslim?
yeah,
It's
exactly.
like a new Muslim 50 years later is still called a new Muslim, which is so. I think you're totally right. It's very clunky
And
terminology,
the
and
way I explain it is, someone could invite me to a meal. I have a choice, right? I can accept it or I can decline it. And I chose to accept it. And that's how it is for me. And, as a blessing, I'm not diminishing it at all. But we need to put these things in a language that other people can understand. And the Chinese were really clever at this, which we've discovered in our research, is that two of the greatest Muslim scholars in the Ming dynasty, decided the only way they could teach Islam to the Chinese was to become Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist monks, which they did. And after they did that, then they said, we can't use Arabic. The Chinese do not know Arabic. We have to use their terminology. So instead of talking about God or Allah, they talked about the Most High or the Most Real. They didn't talk about prophets, they talked about sages. They didn't talk about Iman, they talked about clear light, a clear light that enters the heart. When I read this, I said, amazing, and that's what we didn't understand. Really, we should, because there's more that unites us as a community than separates us. And I'm
Yeah.
talking about the host community in the UK. But if it's presented as something alien, people will always be frightened of it.
Yeah. No, no, I think that's such a valuable point that we need to think, particularly around our identity as well, which
Yeah,
I'll maybe come back to you on that as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Um, for people that don't know the kind of that Norwich Muslim community, and I mean, did you come across people like Yusuf Islam around that time, or
Yeah, I mean, Yusuf
what was that
wasn't
kind of
really
environment like?
connected with that community because he was busy on his own journey. But I mean, many people who are known today came into the. It was really, I mean, we were in Bristol Gardens in London, and then the whole community moved up to Norwich. But people like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf came through, Dr. Omar Abdullah. Not, I think Abdul Hakim came to visit, but he never stayed. A lot of people were curious about that community, and it was an interesting um, phenomena. I mean, it had its own problems, which is like a lot of these things, and I kind of outgrew it at the end. I just realized that it was like a university for me. It was very important, but and then I had to move on. And I think if I hadn't moved on, I wouldn't have met all the great shape that I met in my journey with Meetings Mountains. But yeah, but I really learned this thing about brotherhood and working together, and that was a very precious gift from that community.
Yeah.
And I think it was important. It was important to give Islam a kind of British face, really.
And I guess we're still on that journey to find that proper British Muslim identity,
Yeah,
isn't it? And
yeah,
this,
I'm still working it out because
yeah,
it's kind of, just discovering this whole Chinese thing makes me really think it all over again.
yeah. And so let's come on to your next item, your next gem that you'll take
So
to the desert island.
um, in 2000 and 2003, I wanted to do a book of my work because I'd spent like 30 years just traveling nonstop around the Muslim world and understanding Islam from all these different cultures. And I wanted to do a book, and the idea for the book came for me thinking about, well, what's life going to be like for you when you're much older, and hopefully you're living on some beautiful tropical island somewhere away from the cold of England, and maybe you've got like a juice shop on the beach or something, and how would you think about your life? And I was thinking, well, I'd remember stay moments in my life, but the photos that I took, because they're like the trigger to remembering events. So I thought, okay, yeah, um, that's a good idea for a book. And then I came across the famous hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, I am in this world like a traveler who takes shade under a tree only to resume his journey. And I just was like, that one hadith sums up our whole kind of life here, really. And I remember reading a book called, someone gave me a book, it's a very thin book called The Lives of Man. It's written by a Hadrami scholar and sage, Imam Haddad. And it really describes very clearly, the journey before this world, and then this journey in this world through childhood, uh, adulthood, maturity, and old age, and then what happens to you afterwards. And so this bit is like a section in the middle of it, which has its own stages, but it's not. It's not the only thing, as most people in this world think. And I remember when I was 16 thinking, well, it can't be life just ends like in those days when you switch the TV off, there was like a white spot that disappeared. And I was thinking, life it can't be just that. You have this life and then it's switched off and it's nothing. It doesn't make sense to me. So, then through all my studies and looking at other religions, I realized there was much more to it than just this bit that we're in. So that was important message for me.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you a bit about. I've got your book, one of your books here,
Yeah,
in the
that's the
Shade of
book.
the
Yeah,
Tree.
yeah, that's it. Yeah,
Um, and we'll run through because you've got some wonderful books that you've done over the years. So I've always loved. So before I knew who you were, I'd always obviously seen your pictures, particularly because I was growing up in the '90s, and I guess these were kind of iconic pictures that you would see, and particularly the other one was the sister in the hijab with the British flag.
yeah. We can
Um,
talk about that. Yeah, the art of
yeah,
integration. Yeah, that was very important.
but this one particularly, and we'll send links on kind of the episode show notes. But this front image is the one that's really it's an amazing picture. I mean, are you able to just describe it for the listeners? And do you remember when you took it?
Yeah,
Tell us a bit about
and
that
that
image.
was an important picture for me because I knew about um, Hassan Fateh, the traditional architect, and who used to build in mud, traditional adobe buildings. And I was really keen to visit his mosque in Guarna in South Egypt. And so I went. I went to Luxor, and on that side of Luxor you have all the pharaonic buildings and things, and then you take the ferry across and you go to Guarna, which is on the other side of the Nile. And I went to the mosque. It's really simple, and I went in and looked at it. And to be honest, I didn't really take any pictures inside. I came outside the mosque and I looked back in and I saw this man praying in that pool of light by the simple terracotta wall which had the chalk mark of the divine name on it. And I took I think two pictures, two frames. Now, if I really thought that was a serious picture, I would have shot like a roll of film in those days. It was a throwaway thing. I looked in, saw this thing, took the picture, and then left. I gave there's a very famous calligrapher, Dr. Ahmed Mustafa, who is from Egypt, and I was going to visit him one day, and I took him a print of that, and he looked at it and he said, "Oh, I think that picture's got golden ratio, divine proportion." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Didn't you ever study art?" I said, "No, I didn't. Yeah, I'm self-taught." He said, "Yeah," and he gets his tape measure out and he explains to me about uh, golden ratio, and it's two-thirds light, one-third dark, and it's a very measured thing. I mean, a lot of creation is based on this golden ratio, plants and so many things in creation. If you research it, it's fascinating. He gets his tape measure out and he measured it. He said exactly it. It's 0.666, and I was going, wow, that's a proof that that picture was a gift from God, because it was not, it was just a throwaway thing, and I've really held on to that, and I teach students about that it's really, it was just totally impulsive thing from intuition, and just like, it just didn't really think about it. And if you're in tune, then these things, you get given these gifts, because we have no control over this thing. I mean, God's name is Al Musawir, not us. He is Al Musawir, the creator of forms.
And there must be something in that because that then resonates with the person that looks at the pictures. Like,
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
why did I in the '90s feel that that picture stands out, or why have thousands or millions also thought these are the certain images that somehow I'm connected with, that has some
Yeah.
special meaning for me, and I guess it's a real blessing that you're partly the conduit for that connection, isn't it? That you're
Oh,
able to then share these images that then people, you
I'm,
know, um,
I'm humbled
reflect
by it.
on.
Yeah, I'm humbled by it because people, when I used to travel in the Muslim world, people say, "What do you do?" And I used to say, "Oh, Al Musawir," like, which is a wrong thing to say, actually. So I was saying, I was with a scholar chatting, and I said, "I think all photographers should be called Abdul Al Musawir." And he said, "But also as you said, also the people that are looking at them, because they're also enjoying that aspect of the creator." And I thought, yeah, that puts it on to a whole other level.
And I just wanted to ask you about that, and continuing your own journey then, um, in after your Hajj, because I was reading somewhere that you've been a photographer, you've been taking photos for over 55 years, and
Yeah.
I was astonished to hear you've probably got over 500,000
Well,
pictures.
I think that's a bit exaggerated. I
Is
think
it?
we did a calculation once, and I don't know how we came up with it. The trouble is, I don't know how many digital files there are now, but I mean, I've got uh, like 6 filing cabinets, large ones full of slides, and then there's other stuff in the loft. I mean, it's a pretty high number. There's no way I can calculate it properly, but
But thousands and tens of thousands probably.
yeah, it's a lot anyway.
And I was wondering a little bit around your experience when you know you became a Muslim, because I guess photos and music are kind of some of the fixations of a lot of Muslims in terms of the art and culture. And we know people such as Yusuf Islam who then, when they became Muslim, they said, "Look, we're going to stop that," and then obviously over time, you know they you know they go back to it and then they see um, the benefit and the gift of their talent. Um, did you? Because photos is one of the big things. Because I was just wondering, even when you're going to take pictures in mosque or other places, sometimes that is quite frowned upon. But back in the early days, did you ever consider saying, "Well, I need to reject this photography. I need to stop it," or did anyone say to you, "Look, now that you're Muslim, you shouldn't be taking, you should find something else to do"? Did that ever question arise for you?
Um, no one that I knew told me it was haram, but someone did say, "Oh, you're being very narcissistic. Like you're just photographing yourself, like wherever you do." And it kind of confused me a little bit for a period. But I always loved photography, and I always felt, images spoke to me in a very strong way that nothing else did. I mean, and in '60s, it was music was the big obsession, and then I think now images is a language. I mean, all the youth communicate with images. It's almost like we're going back to how language began, and it's like we're reversing. And I think the youth, I'm generalizing a bit, but they don't read as much as maybe the earlier generations and things. Um, so there was certain things. I mean, I think, in Saudi Arabia, you meet people that tell you it's haram, and the thing is, I never felt it was haram, and the thing was that I had photographed great scholars, and I knew that they wouldn't let me take their pictures if it was haram. Now, I only ever had one man, and it wasn't somebody that I wanted to photograph, but someone asked me, if you're in, I think it was in Turkey, when you're passing through, can you go and take its picture? So I went to him and I asked him, and he said, no, I don't like people photographing me. But then he thought about it. He said, okay, you can take my picture, but don't just like do my head. You have to do my whole body, which was really interesting. It made me think about it a lot, because it's this idea that you disconnect. It's a disconnected head. I totally understand it, and I've always, in photography, you have this thing. It's like head, 2/3, which is like the head, the upper torso, and the arms. You include the arms in it, or then you have the full. You don't cut people's legs off or you cut people's limbs off, even though you might not notice it unconsciously. You have kind of cut off their limbs. So I have given all this stuff a lot of thought about how you do it, and
Yeah.
it's always, for me, it's always about respecting the person. It's not, and I've felt that I've been able to travel to places and meet people that people can't get to. So I always felt that I was like a bridge.
And I think you certainly um captured some of that in I guess your last few pieces of work, and I guess the very most recent one is uh your your books, exemplars for our time,
Yeah,
but the
yeah,
whole meeting with mountains. And
yeah.
um I'm just fascinated by the idea of, I guess, these sheikhs and spiritual people and saintly people then, because usually they're hidden, aren't they?
They
And
are, and
the,
and many of them had never ever um, been photographed before, and my job was to ask them And I wasn't going to try and persuade them, but just hope that they would see the wisdom in letting me take their pictures, because I think at a certain point I would sit with scholars and they would talk about this sheikh and that teacher and this, but I couldn't see them and I would just get lost. It was just too many names. I couldn't keep it in my brain. And I'm a much more visual person. I need to see the face. Then I can remember them. Once I've seen the face, you tell me the story, that's connected. But without the image, I can't I can't keep. I'm not scholarly. I don't have a scholarly brain like that. And so it was really important for me to put a face to those people. And I didn't have anybody that refused to be photographed. And many of them had never been photographed before. Many of them um, passed away after I did the picture, which was very disconcerting for me. I thought, well, if the word gets out, like, it's so arrogant to think that I had any power over everything. And I met Dr. Mustafa Badawi in Medina, and he said, no, that's the reason they let you take their picture. They were leaving. So it didn't matter anymore.
When you're in their presence
Yeah.
or some of these people's presence, is it a, I mean, how do you feel? Is there some special emotions or aura or something around you when you're in that presence, or are you just focused on the photo at the time, or do you feel I'm definitely there's something spiritual, special, and intangible going on in this moment?
Well, I'm lucky I have something to do, so that's a good distraction. If I was just sit there and think about all this stuff, it would be very, very difficult. So I have something to do that stops me being self-conscious in their company.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm well aware that they are very, very special people, and I tried to make it as painless for them because many of them were elderly. Many of them were over 100 years old and stuff, and not going to take me sort of posing them and moving them around. So really, I had to have all my homework done before I actually did the picture. But it was always, I mean, that was the reason I did the book Meetings with Mountains that way. It was really telling that story about what happened when I was in their presence and doing the picture.
And have you always had a preference of take pictures of people rather than places or buildings or?
I prefer people because they're just so fascinating, but it's harder for me for people because I'm quite a shy person and I don't. It's kind of, you have to get over that because people being photographed usually are very nervous anyway. In the West, not so much in traditional. If they're allowing you to take their picture, they don't have an issue. But I think more in the West, people are more sensitive. It's all about identity and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so for me, it's kind of it's easier with those kind of people because they're not putting on a face. Do you understand? They are who they are. Whereas here in the West, we tend to put on a face. That's why the whole selfie generation is such a big thing. It's all about this is me in this place and this is me, and it's all about the self. Whereas they're about the non-self.
And I'm interested in your thoughts on that topic in terms of, I guess, in this present day and age, um, there's a few things particularly around, I guess, photos and images, and I mean, one is that there's so much abundance of images that we see now, both from on our phones, on social media, on TV, etc. Um, and I guess previously, even the process of that, because everything's digital now, it's instant, and I guess traditionally it's I remember the roll up camera that you would take your pictures then send it away for developing, and then you'd be a lot more precious about how many images you could take, and then you wait a few days for it to get back. What impact do you think that has had on us as humans, as people, and is it a good or bad thing, I guess, because it's
um,
it's such a change, particularly in the last probably 10, 20 years, I
yeah,
think.
it's huge. I mean, I used to go off and do trips. I'd be away 6 weeks, and I wouldn't know what I had until I came back. So now you have this modern technology, which was not that great in the beginning. I mean, even I think now it's just maturing into a very interesting medium. And some people say that the iPhone in a year's time will be more sophisticated than most cameras that you can buy. I mean, it does depend on what you want to do with the images, though. I mean, if you're just using it as a kind of um, communicative thing, it's fine for that immediate thing. But I'm amazed there's still some serious uh, hardcore people that still travel around the world with large plate cameras with using film, not. And there's a guy who's very interesting who I really respect, a guy called Jimmy Nelson, who I actually met recently, and I really admire him. He's a really great communicator, and he travels to really remote places, really inaccessible places with a large plate camera. Now, I kind of assumed that he was shooting on digital. He said, no, I take 50 sheets of film with me, which means every photo I take has to count,
Yeah.
because it's all for him. It's all about that moment. And he told me that he went to a school and the kids were saying, why don't you just spray and pray? This thing which is you just wipe the phone over and just shoot masses, and then you can choose one. And he's got such a lot of insight into that, because he says, it's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in that moment when everything comes together, when you've prepared everything, and that is like almost like a moment of unity. And that's what he's about. It's not about anything else. And that's beautiful.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So tell us about your next gem
Okay, so we're going to
city.
have to backtrack because we started talking about um, meetings and mountains, but I'll just get this one in there, because we started to talk about the art of integration and the picture of the. So art of integration came from me after traveling for about 30 years around the Muslim world, and I came back, and this is in the early 2000s, and people were being really stereotyped as Muslims being either shisha smoking Arabs in Edgware Road, or the Pakistani curry shops or something. And it was just like, but that's not my experience. There are English Muslims here. I've met Muslims from every country in England. So I thought I should do something about England. Like I've never done anything about England, and so
And Scotland. And
and
Scotland.
Scotland, of course, yeah. In those days, we were much more united. United. So I came up with this idea to do this project called The Art of Integration, and it really was like to find Muslims in every profession, and just show that they're everywhere, and they don't fit particular stereotypes. It was enhanced by someone told me actually, so it was a scholar said that there were Muslims in this country had three choices. So it was isolation, assimilation, or integration. Isolation is not acceptable because we're community-led people, and assimilation means that you become part of the society, but you lose your core beliefs. And integration is the middle path. I know people don't like this word, but it's in the middle, and I think it's the best description, because my understanding is you are still a Muslim. You can be English, but your private things that mean things to you, like your prayer and how you live your life, they're at the core of you, and that shouldn't be affected. And so that was really my idea about the project. And I wanted to find, the only thing was that everyone I photographed had to have some kind of belief structure in their life. And then I heard there was a scholar who said, um, I'm trying to. Sheikh Bar, who is an African scholar, he described Islam as a crystal clear river, which I thought was really, really beautiful. And he said it's pure, sweet, and unpolluted, and it reflects the color of the riverbed. Therefore, if the rocks on the riverbed are black, the water looks black. And if they're yellow, the water looks yellow. Therefore, in Africa, Islam is African, and in China, it's Chinese, and therefore, in England, it's British. And that was really the whole concept behind art of integration. Yeah.
And that's a beautiful analogy. And I guess that's very much reflected in our own kind of the early history of Islam as well, and
Yeah.
after the Prophet, peace be upon him, time where when the companions and Sahaba went places, and they didn't go there to impose the version from Mecca or Medina, isn't it? Um the culture and the flavor of the local area, and I guess that's the beauty and the diversity actually that we see. But I think probably as a British Muslim community, we're still struggling with that because
Yeah.
there's that pockets of still it's quite an early, it's probably mainly from the 50s and 60s, although we know there were Muslims a lot earlier than that in Victorian times. But I guess it's the 50s and 60s where that mass migration has come, and particularly importing that South Asian and kind of Arab. So I think many of us are hopeful that things will go in the right direction and become more part of this. Because I remember doing workshops in schools around Islam, and you showed them probably I probably stole a lot of your pictures without knowing, but you showed them pictures like different colored people and say who the Muslims here.
Yeah. Yeah.
They'll always say go the brown ones or the
Yeah.
Eastern European, Eastern looking, and really actually saying there's actually white Muslims and there's the color, and I think that's still a lot of education and reflection that we need as a community. Um, and I guess that's where that picture of the sister with the hijab, the Union Jack one, has been such a British flag is just such a striking image, actually.
Yeah, and
Um,
I did that way before I did that project. It was just like we just had this idea to do it, and so I carried it on in the book with the Scottish flags and the Welsh and the Irish, because it's. And I particularly chose the flags of the saints to give it a kind of spiritual element to it. So yeah, it was a good project, and that project went around the world. It went to 40 countries. It even
brilliant.
went to like Timbuktu and like places I didn't go to. And it went to Baghdad during the war and stuff. So I mean, I think it was a bit ahead of its time,
Yeah.
that thing. But anyway, it was a great project to do.
And talking about British identity, I was trying to find the actual clip, but I'm not sure. I just remember Sheikh Hamza talking once in one of his lectures about tea,
Yeah,
and and he talked about you. I'm pretty sure he's referring to you, and he goes, "If anyone knows how to make a proper English cup of tea, they say the Peter Sanders." And have I got that story correct? Is that something
that's the
that
one
you and Sheikh Hamza have something about you?
where he prayed over the tea.
Say that again. Sorry.
The one where he prayed over the tea because we went somewhere where they didn't have very nice tea, and he was like worried for me, and he prayed over it. It was like PG Tips or something, or I can't remember. And I said, "Oh, that's really delicious tea." So,
Are you a bit of a tea connoisseur?
I'm a tea snob. I would say it's terrible, but we've always had this thing. My wife and I. It's like we used to do it with the kids. When the kids came back from school, we would stop and have tea, and so it was a time to be with the kids after they came back from school. And we've always like done it. We've done it wherever we've travelled, even in Sudan deserts. We would stop and light a fire and have tea, and it's just like my ritual. It's like some people have naps in the afternoon. I don't have naps. I have a cup of tea, and then I can go back to work. So it's kind of it's a kind of habit, but because of that, I like to drink nice tea, and so I've kind of it's one of the things I like.
Brilliant, brilliant. Take us to your next item,
Okay,
Celine.
so then we're back to meeting to mountains. Um, One of the Prophet Muhammad's constant prayers was, "Oh God, I ask you for your love and the love of whoever loves you, and the love of deeds that will bring me closer to you and closer to your love." And that was really what Meetings with Mountains was about. These people really love God. They've dedicated their lives to Him, against great difficulties and challenges, and they really are God's servants, and in the true meaning of what that is, they spend their life serving people. And that really was the essence of that book. And it's those faces I wanted to show, because when you see these people and you sit with them, you are changed in their company, and, it was sad for me that always the saints and sages were an integral part of the Islamic world, and for some reason it was made out that they were medieval or old-fashioned, or and it makes me laugh because in the United Arab Emirates they have a minister of well-being. Well, wasn't that what the Sheikh's job was? They have mindfulness centers. Well, that's what the zawiyas were. I mean, it's just like, okay, we just give it another name, but we all need that. We need well-being. We need to feel calm and peaceful, and that's our natural nature. And so really I wanted to put a face to those people and share that with particularly the youth, because I felt they were being distracted and taken down all these routes that was not beneficial for anybody.
Yeah, yeah. And these are quite monumental pieces of work that both of these kind of your more recent ones, both
Yeah.
Meeting with Mountains and Exemplars for Our Time.
Exemplars was really a combination between me and Michael Sugic. I had always wanted with Meetings with Mountains to have at the end of the book some deeper biographies about some of the people, because their lives are so fascinating. But the book Meetings with Mountains already became so big, and it seemed to be like a bit of an add-on to add that at the back. And so we decided that we would look into doing that as a separate project, which is what we did. And we worked on that for 3 years, and it was released last year. And we've nearly sold out, actually. There's just a few copies left, actually.
Really? Are you going to print some more?
No, it's too expensive. It was so expensive to print. It's a 9-box set, and it was such a labor of love. It was meant to be done in a year, and then COVID happened and just slowed down the whole process. But I'm
But it
really
seems
glad we did it. I'm pleased with it. Inshallah, it will get translated into Arabic, or maybe someone will pick it up and we can get it reprinted.
because it's a beautiful kind of synergy there, isn't it? Because I know, so Michael Sugis, has been writing the stories and the capturing that, and you've got the images, so
Yeah,
it just subhanAllah, just
yeah, we're the odd couple, we call ourselves.
and on, I guess, have you ever thought about in terms of your kind of succession as well? Now, obviously, in the Muslim, you know, global community, you're seen as one of the very much the trailblazers around capturing these images. You're perhaps one of the most well-known Muslim photographers of Muslim, um, s- you know, people and individuals and societies, and even the Hajj, etc. Do you think there are people that are coming after you that? Do you see that in the Muslim community? Because I guess for many, when I was growing up as well, very much focuses was on professions and science and, doctors, lawyers,
Yeah,
accountants, and arts and culture and humanities was very much not focused on. And that's such a contraindication, contrast to our own tradition going back, but we seem to have lost it, particularly in the West. Do you see people that are kind of coming through with that focus in the arts and the humanities and culture and photography that will pick up the mantle from you as well, do you think? Or do you think
I
it's
hope,
still we're a bit stagnant in that
I hope
area?
so. It's whether people are prepared to really put in the time. I mean, it's the trouble is people have an iPhone, they think they can take pictures. It's not. You really have to put in your time, and you also have to learn a lot of life skills to be able to photograph people and interact with them, and that's what I teach in my workshops. And we've been doing workshops called the Art of Seeing for the last 10 years, and I'm really passionate about it. When I was asked to do them, I said, "How can I teach? I'm self-taught, and I really didn't think that I could teach it. But after I did one, I realized I do have, stuff that I've learned, and it's so great to find young people who are passionate about photography and share it with them. and I get to teach them about people that they don't know about, because there's a whole world outside of the Muslim community of people, compassionate people that have traveled and spent their lives, same as me, photographing various things, whether it's wars or tribes or whatever, but that in that they have a lot of great skills and a lot of empathy with the people that they photograph. And I think that that's an important thing for us to, share with others.
So take us to your next gem that you're going to
Yeah,
take on the
again,
island.
this is still with Meetings with Mountains. I mean, obviously, Meetings with Mountains came up with a lot of different things, but the title Meetings with Mountains came from Sheikh Hamza when I told him about the project. And then I can't remember, it probably was him that told me the ayah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, have we not made the earth an expanse and the mountains as pegs? So like the physical mountains are the pegs that hold the earth in place. And the same way the men of God, the saints and sages, are also like the pegs. They hold, they're our reference points. And when you look at, I do a lot of work on the Prophet's route in Saudi Arabia. We've been doing a lot of these journeys following the Hijra route and the Prophet route and the different journeys that the Prophet made. And you realize in the hadiths, the mountains are really important, like by Jebel so and so, by Wadi so and so, these things happened. So they are points of reference. And so I love this synergy between the title and physical mountains. And there's the guy called Mustafa Salama. He's a really interesting person. Going off on a tangent a bit, but very briefly, he had a dream in which he was standing on the highest summit, calling the adhan and making the prayer. And he called a friend up and he said, "What's the highest summit?" And his friend said, "Well, it's Mount Everest." So he then trained. He'd never climbed a mountain. He trained and climbed Mount Everest and called the adhan and prayed up there. And he's now done the what they call the Grand Slam, the 7 mounts. And he's been to the North Pole and the South. He's always traveled. Every time I get in touch, where are you? I'm just about to go up Mount Everest. He's such a great guy. He's really inspirational. And he said when he was at the top of Mount Everest, he felt he was with all the prophets,
SubhanAllah.
Yeah.
It does really does something to you when you hear these stories, doesn't it? It's so inspirational and so much for reflection. Just because of time, should we go on to your next item as
Yeah,
well?
yeah. So the final one from Meetings with Mountains is the whole world is a hospital. This is what Sidi Imam Habib used to say to us. The whole world is a hospital, and the saints and sages are the nurses and the doctors.
Yeah.
So as we have physical doctors for our bodies, the saints and sages are the doctors for our heart, spiritual ailments.
It's beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful.
I love it, and it's such a strong reference point for me that.
Yeah. And I was wondering about um this aspect of sacrifice, because I guess anybody that achieves anything um significant, you can't achieve any of that without sacrificing something.
Yeah.
Um, what sort of sacrifices do you think you've had to make throughout your life to be able to share these things and pursue this, this passion and this love? And who's been in the background there to help you or enable you to do what you need to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, and someone got in touch with me recently and about exemplars and said, it seemed that Sheikh Jafari, Salih Al Jafari, spent a lot of time away from his family, and they kind of were questioning that. And my only thing I could say about that was, it's not the quantity of time; it's the quality of time. And I also am guilty of that, because in the early years I was traveling all the time, and I left my wife looking after. We had, I had my son from a previous marriage and 3 daughters, and she really looked after them. I mean, I used to come back, and it was difficult, being away from them. But I was doing my thing, and it was funny. I'm sorting out all my stuff in the loft, and I found all these postcards that I'd sent to the girls when they were very young. And I showed it to my daughter, and she said, "We always used to think that you went away and forgot about us." And that it was very clear that I did, but they were too young to read them. So my wife would have read them to them. But, like it was kind of, oh, you didn't forget us. You didn't just go away and forget us. It was just like, and it's easy, but I needed to do it. This was it was my livelihood and what I was doing on my journey. So, yeah, I think that's probably the biggest sacrifice.
And I guess that's one of the things about in childhood as well, isn't it? Sometimes um, you only realize, I guess, your parents' journey or sacrifices when you're older or when you're getting to a parent. And actually, I think those
Yes.
ideas you have at that time that if somebody's away or absent, actually, it's sometimes for you, or
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
something that will help you and lots of other people around the world. And when you get older, you know children will often develop those insights later on. So it's kind of making the patient game. Well,
But
it's hard
I
at the
think,
time, but.
but I think there has to be, as I said, there has to be a balance of it. I mean, I met somebody in Medina, and he said, "Oh, I only ever go back to Bangladesh. It was like every year, every 2 years." And he said, "The last time I went back, my daughter said, 'Who's this strange?' To his mother, to his wife, 'Who's this strange man in your bed?' She didn't even know who her father was, and that's tough because that's not fair to a child.
Yeah. So it's finding that
And
balance,
it's
isn't it? And everyone's situation is different. And I think if you have somebody who can fill the gaps while you're away, I guess that makes it easier and that becomes enabling as well, isn't
Yeah,
it? And
I mean, I think in traditional societies, they're always the grandparents to fill in the gaps. I mean,
yeah.
in this sort of society, I mean, Muslims tend to hold on to that, but in general society, it's so separated, and it's a problem, really.
And are you quite an emotional person? Are you quite a sensitive person?
I think yeah. I couldn't do what I do without being quite sensitive. I'm English, so I probably control my emotions a lot.
Yeah. Stiff upper lip.
Yes, always be stoic.
Yeah. And during the most difficult times in your life, what has kind of got you through
Well,
those
I think
moments?
it's a basic trust in God that, and we need reminding. Things happen, and you think, why did that happen? Then I've just learned that happened to protect you about something worse happening. It's like all these things that happen to. There's a reason in it. We may not see it, whatever it is, but later on in your journey, you will know why that happened. Everything happens for a reason. Absolutely everything.
Take us to your next
Okay.
gem.
Um, and this is an important one for me at the stage of my life that is now. In the exemplars for our time, Sidi Hamza, on the one that he talked about, his teacher, Sheikh Muhammad al-Hajj, he talked about the later years of his life. And he said, for Muhammad al-Hajj, the sacred monotony of his life was his daily practice. And so it was a constant working on being present with God. And he said, because if one is present with God, one is present with his creation. And so there's this idea that every day is like Groundhog Day, but it is actually. I mean, every day is presented, it's a new day, it's a new opportunity for us. But there becomes this idea it's boring. But I think if you have certain things structure in your life, like for us, the prayer, and for me, stopping to have afternoon tea, and then my work is all woven in between that and family life and everything. It is okay. It can at times be appear to others it's very monotonous, but actually within that monotony is great sacredness.
Yeah. And I think that's beautiful, and it also reminds us, I guess, that idea of consistency and and effort is not something often we think about these saints as just they wake up in the morning and they're saintly, is actually
I
through,
wish.
through through months
It's,
and years and decades of working and challenging, and
struggle.
just like probably for you, people will externally see you aimlessly take a picture, not knowing for 50, 60 years, you've been refining, practicing,
Yeah,
practicing. And I think that's something, and that's one of the dangers of this current society, and particularly things with social media. We think, we only see the good bits, and we think that people's lives are perfect, and you don't see all of the hard work,
yeah,
consistency. So I think that's a beautiful reminder, actually, in terms of
yeah,
maybe that consistent daily practice is perhaps where you reap the rewards later on and reap the blessings, isn't it?
yeah. And I really reflect on that a lot, because it's funny. When I was young, I had so much time on my hands, and now I'm, where I am now, and I'm just so busy every day. I don't have a lot of time for sacred monotony, but there is. I mean, there are parts of the day when, oh, what am I doing next? Or, like, oh, help, nothing's happening. Why is nothing happening? You get used to being busy. And then when it's
Yeah,
not busy, oh, okay, what do I do? No, enjoy it. You got a bit of time to read or do
yeah,
something, that you don't have time to do normally. So
yeah. Okay.
it's appreciating
Um,
those moments.
I mean, and how do you relax, or what makes you laugh? Like when you're not working and when you're not taking photos,
No, I mean, it's funny. I had 3 years where I didn't really travel. I'm just about to start traveling again. It's a little bit daunting for me. I'm not getting younger, and I'm going off to do these pretty tough trips. And I'm like, well, can you still do this? Like, but I'm sure once I get into it, I'll be fine. And it's probably better that there won't be so much stress around it. I think there was always a lot of stress on it when I did all this stuff before, and my body took the toll of it. Now my body won't let me. You can't have any stress in your life. So now I've got to just go and enjoy it. I'm just like, okay, enjoy being in all these places, enjoying taking pictures, and just enjoying meeting people. And yeah. It's like,
and you spoke about the in terms of your projects, the China book.
yeah,
Are there any other kind of projects or
yeah,
things that you're working on or you'd like to
yeah.
develop?
I'm gonna inshallah, I'm gonna do a book about Uzbekistan. So that's, I'm gonna be going to Uzbekistan this year and next year to do some work on something. And then I don't know, I have endless projects I want to do. But I'm being encouraged to also do like a visual. I don't know, like to call it a memoir, but it's like a retrospective or something. And I'm working on that. I'm getting some pretty interesting ideas to do that, because it's kind of, for some people looking at me, that I did all this rock stuff and then I spend my life in sacred places and um, visiting saints, and say, they can't understand it. But they have to understand that sitting with the photographing rock stars was an opportunity for me to have a one-to-one with them, because they were the heroes at the time. They were the spokespeople of that cultural revolution, and so we look towards them for trying to make sense of it all. Now my, I wouldn't say Kibla, but my focus has changed. It's still the same though. I'm still searching. I'm still looking. It doesn't. It's not any different. And I quite like these extremes because they're all one thing.
Yeah. And when we hit kind of middle age onwards, I guess we all start to think about our legacy and how we want to be remembered. What's your kind of, how would you like to be remembered, or what legacy would you like to leave behind?
It's so funny because when I met Jimmy Nelson, within 10 minutes of talking to him, he said, "What's your legacy?" And I said, "I don't know. I've never really thought about it. And I need somebody to tell me, because I'm too busy in it to know what it is. And I've never really thought about it like that, because I've just followed my own kind of passions and my intuition and my own journey, that I don't know what it is. I need somebody that can see and write it out for me, because I'm about to try and create a foundation. So I need to say what my legacy is, but I don't know what it is.
Sounds like you're very much in the present, and you live
I'm
in the
trying
present,
to,
don't you?
yeah. I really,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
absolutely.
meeting all these sheikhs has taught me. They are so present. It's scary.
Yeah. Tell us about your final items.
I just want to say, yeah, that you know, you meet these people and they remember everything of you, and if you they'll ask about you, they never forget about you. I meet people all the time, I've forgotten their name in 5 minutes. It's just like, you know, it's just a Western problem. We can't be present, and so
Yeah.
that becomes, okay, I've got to practice, I've got to try and be present, and photography helps me that a lot, you know, it really does.
Yeah.
And the final thing is, it's a quote from Sidi Mohammed Habib, and it's a thing I always finish my presentations with. And so it's he wrote a diwan. They were a collection of poems that he wrote, and they're all guidance for the spiritual path. And this is just two couplets out of one of his great qasidas. And he said, "For if a person truly knew the worth of his heart, he would give all he had without hesitation. And if a person came to know the bliss within his soul, he would shed a tear of joy with every breath he took."
SubhanAllah.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful, I mean, that is something to aim for, you know, and to aspire to. And it's just because that's what our journey is about, you know,
Yeah.
to get to that. I realized yesterday, I was talking with somebody yesterday, and he was laughing about how we used to always complain about everything, you know, and he just said, you know, we used to complain about it. He said, we used to complain about the Wahhabis, and now look what happened after that. We should have said, we should. And it's just like, if you complain about things, they get worse, right? And they'll get worse and worse until you start thanking God for whatever happens is perfectly fine.
I think that's very timely with our recent politicians in Britain and America. You think the next one can't get any worse. And so careful what you wish for them.
Yeah, so we really
SubhanAllah.
need to be just more grateful, really. I think you know, we live in societies where we have so much. I mean, of course, there are things not working, but we have a lot to be grateful. If you look around what's happening around the world, really.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
So in our final few moments together,
Yeah,
Sidi, I was just wondering if you were to meet a younger Peter in his teens or early 20s,
yeah.
what would you say to him or what advice would you offer him?
Oh, tell him to stop worrying about stuff. You know, worrying is about, I've learned, is all about what if. What if this happens? What if that happens? When something does happen, you deal with it, right? You don't even think about it. You go into the mode and deal with it, emergency. So you waste a lot of time worrying about stuff. And I think that's really important for people from this society. There's so much anxiety and fear about everything.
Yeah.
So definitely that would be one advice. Try and be more patient, you know. But I think photography really has been teaching me about patience and stuff.
Yeah.
And then being grateful. I mean, that's, you know, I said that it's really, we've a lot to be grateful for, you know.
Yeah. And the first point you mentioned, I think, resonates so much because um, I guess ultimately it's accepting that the way things happen is the way they're supposed to happen,
Yes,
isn't it? And that's part of God's plan. And
absolutely.
it's that, in our limited wisdom at the time, we might think it's good or bad, but it was supposed to happen that way. And it's just that learning of that acceptance that, inshallah there will be benefit or there'll be a reason for why things have gone a certain way. And I guess because often that anxiety and that worry is about, you want things, your expectations, you
Yeah,
want things to go, and sometimes
absolutely.
just being accepting, you make your efforts, you try your best, and if things are going down a certain path, and that's the way it's destined to be, and inshallah that will be benefit. But
Reading
that I guess
it's reading the signs, as I started off with, you know.
yeah.
You know, um,
Okay. So last few questions, Siddhi, is so you're on the desert island. I mean, how do you think you will cope on a desert island, and you'll be on your own, and with that solitude, do you think
yeah, I might
you'll
quite
do well, or
enjoy
do
it
you
for
think
a
you'll
while,
struggle?
actually. Yeah, it'd be quite nice for a while, I think, as long as it's warm. Yeah,
As we talk, during the winter in Britain, which is
yeah.
miserable and grey, but alhamdulillah. And what book, apart from the Quran, would you take with you to this desert island
Yeah, I was
if you could
thinking
take a
about that. It's really, There's so many books that I love, but I probably would take The Lives of Man because it really does teach you about what's going to happen next, and the stages that you go through. It's like a manual. Or it would either be that or Cinema Habib's D1. I mean, they're both books very, very important to me. I love Cinema Habib's D1. It's got so much wisdom in it. So I don't know. I'd be torn between the two actually. At least with his D1, I could sing it, and there's benefit from singing the Qasidas. So maybe it would be that.
Beautiful. And what if you could take a luxury item with you
Yeah.
on
Now
this desert island?
this is a difficult question. Is it considered that I'll have my cameras with me anyway?
You would. I think when we spoke before, you said that's part of you, so it's
Yeah. Okay. Well,
that's
then
part.
then the obvious thing is like my tea set, and a lot of tea, so I could stop in the afternoon. I'd have to have a goat or something I could get milk. I only take a tiny bit of milk, but I'd need a little bit of milk. Yeah, so I just have my bone china tea set
Absolutely, you can have that
and
indeed.
endless supplies of nice organic tea. Yes, that'd be wonderful.
Not just PG tips.
No, no, no.
Well, Siddhi, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real honor, a blessing, and privilege to hear about your story and your reflections and your lessons that you've learned in many, many decades of your photography and your commitment to the Muslim Ummah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to give you the energy, the
I
strength,
mean,
the passion, and the blessing to continue the work that you're doing. I know that you're still traveling and you're still really out there. So, alhamdulillah, it's been a real honor and privilege. And thank you so much for sharing some of your insights in your desert island gems.
thank you for inviting me. It's good, to reflect on, I think, on our journeys in life. It's really important to sit and reflect and why did this happen? Why did that happen? And try and make sense of it, because God made sense of it. We have to just see what the plan was.
I'm sure it'll be lots of inspiration and opportunity for other people to reflect as well on
Yeah.
your own experiences. So, Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum, and keep us all in your prayers and
Ameen,
your du'as.
inshallah. Thank you. And remember me, okay, inshallah, in your prayers. Thank you. Bye.